Okay, now it comes. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I'm sorry we're starting 6 minutes late. I had some pastoral mingling to do. But today we are going to be giving some updates and information about what's going on in the United Methodist Church. I want to thank my panelists for joining with me and offering their perspectives as well. I'm going to kick us off with some introductory information that I think is important to have before we have any further conversation down the road. So first, we do have some important terms that I think we need to go over, in part because United Methodists use a lot of acronyms. It's kind of our shtick. We do acronyms and committees. Those are our two set skill sets. So the first term we're going to go over is annual conference. And this is important for us to address because it is many things. An annual conference is a regional body, an organizational unit, and a yearly meeting. And I think part of the confusion sometimes with folks who are not deep in United Methodism is that when I say annual conference, you all only think of the meeting. Because a conference is a gathering, a meeting of colleagues. But the annual conference is also the regional body that meets at this annual meeting. It is also the organizational unit of the United Methodist Church. So there is no 501c3 international organizational headquarters that is the United Methodist Church that exists as an entity. Okay? We don't have a headquarters. Our headquarters are the annual conferences. Okay? Our annual conference is the Pacific Northwest Annual Conference. Most annual conferences are also what we call an Episcopal area. An Episcopal area is an area overseen by the episcopacy, in our case, being a bishop. Our Episcopal area is not our annual conference. So this is where we need some clarification, okay? We are the Pacific Northwest Annual Conference. That is the state of Washington, a couple of churches in Canada, and northern Idaho. Our Episcopal area, meaning the area that our bishop oversees, is our annual conference, Pacific Northwest. The Alaska Annual Conference, which just to make it extra confusing, will become a district of our annual conference at the General Conference. And Oregon, Idaho Annual Conference, which you can guess is Oregon and southern Idaho. Okay? And that is called the Greater Northwest. So if I use Greater Northwest or G&W, I'm talking about the whole area overseen by our bishop. If I just say P&W or Pacific Northwest, I'm just talking about our annual conference. Okay? The annual conferences are the organizational building blocks of the United Methodist Church. Okay? And then there's jurisdiction, which is a geographic area made up of many annual conferences. We have 5 in the United States. Okay? Western, you can guess that's where we are. Yes. North Central, Southeastern, South Central, and Northeastern. Okay? So you think of the geography of the United States, those are the 5 jurisdictions that we deal with in the United States. Okay? Then there's the annual conference as a meeting, there's the jurisdiction, and then there's the jurisdictional conference. Tom Robinson has been a delegate to our jurisdictional conference. Their job is to basically set budgets, elect bishops. Okay? Our next jurisdictional conference is next summer in Spokane. So if any of you are curious about how we do these things, you are welcome to join us. It will be at Spokane Valley. I'll be helping with some of the organization and probably running around like a crazy person. So if you would like to know more information about that, it will be in July of next year at Spokane Valley United Methodist Church. Okay? As I said, this is a quote directly from any of our informational websites. The United Methodist Church does not have a central headquarters or a single executive leader. Duties are divided among bodies that include the General Conference, the Council of Bishops, and the Judicial Council. As a refresher for everyone, you can think of the organization of the United Methodist Church as being a mirror image of the the American government in that sense, okay? So we have three branches of government in the United States. What are they?
Legislative, judicial.
Executive, correct? Does anyone want to take a guess at which of these is which? General Conference is our legislative branch, okay? We'll talk about that in a second. The Council of Bishops, anyone want to guess? Executive. And the Judicial Council is judicial, okay? General Conference, well, can you go to the next slide and I'll explain it then? Next one. General Conference, the legislative body of the United Methodist Church, is made up of equal representation of laity and clergy. Okay? Judicial branch is only laity, and Council of Bishops, the executive branch, is only clergy. So usually we try to keep equal representation of clergy and laity throughout the class. The General Conference, this is an important distinction for us to make. This is our international body. Okay? Annual conferences are geographic, jurisdictional conferences are geographic. General Conference is our international legislative body made up of clergy and laity and equal representation from everywhere in the world that we have United Methodism. Okay? It's supposed to happen every 4 years. This will become clear why that was a problem because of COVID in a few minutes. Delegates to the General Conference are elected at the annual conference, missionary conference, or provisional conference level. So if you're developing a new world site, it can be either provisional or missionary annual conference. Okay? They are elected 1 to 2 years prior. Again, we'll talk about how that has changed because of COVID. Laity elect laity. Okay? That means that clergy aren't picking the lay representatives. Laity aren't picking the clergy. Clergy elect clergy is based on the size of the annual conference. Again, very similar to how we make up the House of Representatives, right? So, General Conference was supposed to take place in 2020. We all know why that didn't happen. Yes? Yes, COVID. So it didn't happen in 2020. Initially, the United Methodist body thought that COVID would be over faster, like we all did. And so they didn't push it as far as they could have initially. So they just pushed it to 2021. When that became clear that wasn't going to happen, they pushed it again to 2022. When it became clear that couldn't happen, it was considered to be pushed to 2023. However, if we're supposed to have it every 4 years, that would mean we would have one 2023, 2024. You can imagine the expense of an international conference made up of United Methodists from everywhere around the world. That means we have to have a conference center, we have to have hotel reservations, we have to have rental cars, we have to be in a city large enough to have an airport. These things are expensive, and then if you add to those costs that our poorest countries have to travel the farthest, the cost of having back-to-back general conferences was impossible for our international delegates and for most of our American delegates. And so that was not going to happen. It's supposed to happen last fall, but in last May, for 2022, they were spending several months to determine if it was possible to have them 2 years apart, if we were far enough out of COVID for international delegates to make it, etc. We do have a United Methodist building directly across the street from Congress, and so United Methodists were going and talking to congressional leaders like, hey, can we get visas for these folks? Is it possible? And the resounding answer was no. We can't get our international delegate visas in time for them to come for a 2022 General Conference, which means if we held it in 2022, it would only be representatives from the United States and Canada. We can see why that would be deeply troubling. Yes? So the decision was made. We can't do that then, so it just has to happen in 2024. That was announced in early May of 2022. So the dates, in case you're curious, are April 23rd through May 3rd of 2024, and it will take place in Charlotte, North Carolina. The General Conference rotates in location. It's supposed to rotate by jurisdiction. So it's their turn. This is an important clarification. I'm just going to say this now, and then we'll talk about what disaffiliation means. Disaffiliated churches and members do not get voice or vote at a General Conference level. So if someone was elected as a delegate to the General Conference, and then their church disaffiliated, and they went with them and did not remain United Methodist, they don't get to go vote, okay? For obvious reasons. Again, and then just another key term, the discipline is the governing constitution of the United Methodist Church, of all of our bylaws, of all of our rules. Methodists are really into the discipline. It can only be amended or changed by the General Conference and then affirmed by annual conference vote. The same way we would change the Constitution of the United States. Okay? Next slide. What is disaffiliation? It is the process by which a local congregation withdraws its membership from the United Methodist Church. This is important enough. There has always been a process for this in the discipline. Okay? There's always been a way that a local church can say, we are out. To have a vote, go through the process, and depart from the United Methodist Church. It is a lengthy and costly process. Okay? The local church. Here's why. Most of you might not know this unless you grew up in the United Methodist Church. We do not own our buildings. They are held in trust by the United Methodist Annual Conference. Okay? For those who don't grow up in our tradition, that might feel really weird. If you think about it, though, right? Let's just use Covenant as an example, right? Covenant was started in 1980, and United Methodists, committed to being United Methodists, have over the last almost 50 years now, which is crazy, contributed in blood, sweat, and tears, and prayers, and financially and physically to this building. So hypothetically, if a generation of church members comes along and says, well, we don't want to do that anymore, does it make sense that they then just get to leave with that building when not only has there been investment at the local level, but the annual conference has invested in us? The annual conference leads the process by which I was appointed here, and every pastor we've ever had has been appointed here and will be appointed here. They manage so many assets for us. They invest in us in very real, meaningful ways, beyond financial as well. So it's not just the purpose of buying the building at the market value. Okay? You are not just doing that because we also have covenantal bonds to the annual conference by the budget that we contribute, which are called apportionments, that we spend every month, every year. We have a commitment to that. And pensions for pastors and other folks who work for the annual conference at the districts and different things. Our financial investment in the annual conference allows the annual conference to budget for many years, and if we suddenly take our ball and go home, we've covenantally broken something that impacts other people as well. You not only have to pay not just the market value of your property, but the covenantal value of your property. You have to pay out many years of the covenanted apportionment that you planned. It's a very expensive process to withdraw. Which brings us to what's happening right now. It's called paragraph 2553. Mike, would you hit the next slide for me, please? The next one. Oh, sorry. Barry. This is the beginning. I'm not going to read all of paragraph 2553 because it's very long. Like I said, we're really into our bureaucracy sometimes. Disaffiliation of local churches over issues related to human sexuality. This was introduced to the discipline, again, our governing constitution, as a result of the 2019 special conference. Because of the current deep conflict within the United Methodist Church around issues of human sexuality, a local church shall have a limited right under the provisions of this paragraph to disaffiliate from the denomination for reasons of conscience regarding a change in the requirements and provisions of the Book of Discipline related to the practice of homosexuality or the ordination or marriage of self-avowed practicing homosexuals as resolved and adopted by the 2019 General Conference, or the actions or inactions of its annual conference related to these issues which follow. Yes, and this goes on for many, many, many paragraphs. I will only offer this one where I had it underlined. The provisions of paragraph 2553 expire on December 31st, 2023, and shall not be used after that date. That's built into the discipline, okay? That date is important. We will talk about it some more, but this is where that date comes from. It's not an arbitrary thing, okay? Yeah. We go to the next slide. Okay, these are just some quick facts. Before I hand over to Marty, who's going to give us some background, and then I will give us a little bit more of the recent background, and we'll keep going. Spokane has an United Methodist Church on the Pacific Northwest Annual Conference in the Western Jurisdiction, as a part of the Greater Northwest Episcopal Area. Approximately 6,000 churches have been affiliated since 2019 of 30,000 in the United States. We are part of the Western Jurisdiction, and this is our statement of inclusivity as a part of the Western Jurisdiction. The Western Jurisdiction statement is entitled Where Love Lives. We are committed to living out our belief that God's church is open to all. The United Methodist Church in the Western Jurisdiction is a scripturally based and fully inclusive ministry. This campaign, called Where Love Lives, includes resources for local churches as faithful, inviting, open space, and loving places to engage in conversations centering on being the church for all people. Learn more about the campaign by clicking on the button below. That's on the Western Jurisdiction website. If you guys want more information, that's a great spot for it. I think there's one more slide. Sorry. This is the website. You just Google Western Jurisdiction United Methodist Church. You want next? Okay. I'm going to hand it off to Marty. I need to go backwards. Yes. I'll come to that one. There, you can just turn off the slides for now. I'll just turn off this thing. I don't want to be distracted. Ooh, that's so much work. Oh. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, wrong slide.
I'm just going to share about my own experience with the issues that is before us. And in the context of having been a delegate to annual conference from, I think it was 2001 to 2009, if I'm not mistaken. And we joined Covenant in 1984. We love this church. We love the people in the church. But there had been initial concern about the issue of LGBTQ plus people in the Methodist tradition. And we had a issue come up in the late 90s regarding trial for one of the pastors in our conference. And the result of that caused some of our members to leave because our pastor wouldn't disavow the decision that was to not convict the pastor. And so we knew that this issue was becoming more and more present. And I look around and I see most of the people, all people in this room are probably 50 and over. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. No, don't correct me. And I think that reflects one of the issues that's confronting us. If we talk to our children who are in their 50s and our grandchildren in their 20s, this is not an issue. It is a cultural divide that has been growing in the country. And so when I went to annual conference, I enjoyed the experience. You get together, you discuss current issues. But what I found over that 8-year period of time is that this one issue became more and more central to the annual meetings. And it was divisive. It caused problems for me because I felt like we weren't getting anything else done. It was at that stage of this development that a way forward just wasn't clear to everyone. And just from a personal expression of this, there were some things that really were hurtful to me in terms of several pastors at that time you could not be LGBTQ or declare that you were and be a pastor. And that comes from the fact that the book of discipline that's developed every 4 years lays down the rules for the Methodist Church. And the official position of the Methodist Church at that time was, this is not okay. And so, but there was bubbling up a growing desire to address this issue. And during that period of time, several pastors, I remember one in particular, a young man, well, he was probably 40, seemed young to me, who had grown up in the church, loved the church, was a great pastor. I had spoken to him, came out at annual conference and said, I'm gay, and I'm being required to leave my pastorate. And the whole congregation was at Woodland Park in Seattle, came in support. They wrote a document to say this, and it was just painful to listen to. I mean, this young fella was genuine in his faith, was obviously a very good pastor, and yet for that reason alone, he wasn't practicing. He was being kicked out. And then a number of, really the movement was led by women in the church, female pastors, and I think that arose out of their own experience of the challenge of becoming a pastor as a woman. So they knew the struggles that go with this whole idea of exclusion, of telling people they can't belong because of a certain issue. And it just didn't feel right to me. And gradually then I left going, and it wasn't just because of that. I mean, I'd done 8 years. I didn't want to continue doing it. And then when later, after we are still here, Jason and I approached church council. One or both of us were on it. I don't remember which. And put forward the idea that we become a reconciling church. This was in 2017. And at that time, that was the only avenue, and that was just in the Western jurisdiction.
Just real quick, does anyone not know what that means? Explain.
It means you're open and accepting, affirming of our brothers and sisters who are LGBTQ. And our council said, yes, we want to pursue this. They asked us to draft a welcoming statement, which we did. It was adopted at that November's charge conference, which is when everyone in the church gets together. And by overwhelming vote at that time, I think it was 30-2, that we would be a welcoming church. And then things just started to explode nationally, and so there was no point in going through reconciling anymore. It was a lengthy, multi-year process. So that's really what I wanted to share at this point. And just one other thing, because Methodism is a connectional church, that means pastors, we don't select. Pastors are hired by our conference. And that's always been the way in the Methodist Church, and that's unusual. I grew up Lutheran, and we called our own pastors. So it was different here, and just like this idea that Megan addressed about not owning our own building. We're part of a connectional ministry that means we're trying to be inclusive to everyone that's in it, and our responsibility is to try to maintain the bonds of a connectional program. All right?
So how did we get where we are? I think it's important for us to know that the United Methodist Church has been talking about human sexuality for a really long time. So while the larger culture of the United States hasn't been talking about it openly for too long, I would say, probably a couple decades, in the United Methodist Church, this conversation has been taking place since the 60s. So this is a long conversation. You can see we don't move very fast. It kind of reached a head. So to Marty's point, he said that this movement has largely been led by women, both lay women and clergy women. During the AIDS epidemic, United Methodist women were critical in caring for folks who were dying of HIV. Okay? They would create a lot of churches around the country, especially in San Francisco or Kansas City, Missouri, or some other places where a lot of LGBTQ folks were kind of going to live, so they wouldn't literally be sold. It was United Methodists that turned their churches into hospitals and would have folks just that had nowhere else to go and were dying come and live in the church and take care of them. So I think what's important about this for me is that this conversation for us has always been because we have been in relationship with people who are LGBTQ, right? This isn't a scheme to get young people into the church. This isn't us caving to pressure from outside forces. This is the inside of our church saying, we know these people, we love these people, and it's causing us to look at Scripture in a different way. And then simultaneously, scriptural scholarship has been looking at these texts of these 6 passages, 6 verses in all of the Bible. There's much more that are very anti-women or very pro-slavery that we read differently. These 6 verses have been looked at by scholars who are much smarter than me when it comes to biblical stuff, and they said, I'm not sure this is what it's trying to say. And so all these forces kind of come together. It's a coalescing a lot of streams. So in the 90s, as Marty said, it came to a head at our annual conference. And then in the 2000s at the global church level, particularly in, Rob, Tom, what delegation, what year was Bishop Oliveto elected? Was it 2012? I think it was 2012 as well. So in 2012, the Western jurisdiction elected Bishop Karen Oliveto, who's still currently a bishop. She's getting ready to retire. She's very excited. Bishop Oliveto was the very first openly gay and partnered person elected to be a bishop of the United Methodist Church. And that was in 2012. Tom was on that delegation. If you have questions about it, I'm sure he'd love to talk to you. And Bishop Karen is now serving as the bishop of Big Sky. So Montana, the Colorado, Dakota, etc. And that really brought the conversation to the very forefront at the international level, because the Western jurisdiction said she is the best equipped person for this job, and we believe in her ministry, and even if it goes against the discipline, which Methodists don't do that, we said this is the right thing to do, and she is the right person that God has led her to us. So she was elected. So then in the 2016 General Conference, that's the international body, right, a study group was formed to reflect on homosexuality and where we were at as a denomination, right? Because we have churches in, we have churches in parts of the world, specifically in Eastern Europe, parts of Asia, and parts of Africa, where being gay is a capital offense, okay? So, as Marty said, we are a connectional body. So we also have to ask the question, if we change our discipline, is that going to cause these churches to be arrested and to be executed by their government? That was the conversation that was happening at the study level, right? Is where are we at? Where are people at? Geographically, where are people at where this might harm them? And are we prepared to make a decision for them that would harm them? Or are we including them in the conversation? As a part of that study group, a decision was made because at the 2016 General Conference, Adam Hamilton, so the United Methodist Cradle, people know who he is. He is the pastor of the largest United Methodist church in the world. It is in Kansas City, called the Church of the Resurrection. I've met Adam. Claim to fame. He probably has no idea who I was. Said on the floor of the General Conference in a speech that United Methodism is divided on human sexuality. And that statement gave rise to a conversation saying, how do we divide then, or how do we come to agreement, consensus? I'll say consensus, not agreement. So the 2019 was set for what's called a special conference. You might notice that all the general conferences are on even years, because they happen every 4 years, and 2019 is on an even year, okay? So that means we planned a special in-between conference of an international gathering of pastors and clergy from everywhere around the world, and said we need to have an extra meeting just to talk about human sexuality. And that was the decision. It was in 2019 in Portland, Oregon, and there were 3 proposals on the table. One was called the traditional plan, And what I want to emphasize about the traditional plan is that it wasn't just saying, so there was a traditional plan, what I'm going to call the, because it didn't really have a good name, the traditional plan, we're going to call it the status quo plan, and then the open and affirming plan, okay? Open and affirming means we were going to, as an entire denomination, become open and affirming. Status quo plan was, we're just going to leave things the way they are and keep going. And the traditional plan was not just saying we don't support this, which our discipline already says that. It was to say, and we will expel churches and pastors that don't agree. Okay? That's what I think is important for us to know, right? There were two plans on the table for voting that said we will not be open and affirming, and one that was, and we will punish people who are. Okay? At the 2019 special conference, the traditional plan passed by a margin this big. Okay? So because it was a special conference, it did not need our typical requirement, did not need to have our typical requirement of 66%. It needed 51%, and it had 51% by like 20 votes. Okay? In part because the other two plans were so different that people were like, I don't know. And then within about 2 weeks of that special conference, national news agencies broke the news that folks showed up and voted who were not delegates. Okay? A lot of them. An unknown amount. And if legislation passed with a margin of 20 votes, and we don't know how many people were illegitimate voters, that shows that it's a very significant problem, right? And then in the immediate aftermath of that passing, right, this means that by discipline now, our entire annual conference of Western jurisdiction are in danger. And our bishop at the time, Bishop Zanofsky, along with several other bishops from around the country, said, that's really lovely, but I won't be doing that, thank you. And created a process that we have in the Pacific Northwest Conference called the Safe Harbors Protocol, by which pastors who are being targeted because they either are LGBTQ or are allies of LGBTQ persons could have their ordination transferred immediately to the Pacific Northwest Conference and be protected. So they couldn't be stripped of their ordination. That's the process by which I became United Methodist. Okay? Because that was the issue that the Church of Nazarene was like, no.
Yes. This is inviting pastors of all faiths or just your?
So initially it was only going to be United Methodist, but we have other Methodist traditions that we are in connection with. For instance, African Episcopal Methodist, African Episcopal Methodist Zion, the British Methodist. There's some South American Methodist traditions that aren't United Methodist. So it was initially just going to be United Methodist, but then very quickly they realized we need to make this bigger. I was the first one brought in from a non-Methodist tradition. Okay? Making history, folks. So in the aftermath of 2019, this is when the General Conference started this Where Love Lives campaign and said, we're not going to do that. Thank you very much. And it wasn't just us. What I will say is typically, both culturally in the United States and within United Methodism, culture starts on the West Coast and goes to the middle slowly. Right? Cultural changes happen on the coast, especially on the Western coast. And so it's not surprising that the West Coast is like, hey, no. And then the East Coast is like, hey, no. And then people in the middle were like, we don't know. That's just kind of how culture shifts in our country. I've lived in the Midwest for many years. I love people there. I'm not bashing them. I'm just saying that's how it happens anthropologically. So because of all these things, and especially with knowing that illegitimate votes were counted, we don't really know if this is a reflection of the wish of the people. A bishop gathered together a committee to create a plan to submit in time for the 2020 General Conference, which did not give him a lot of time. He gathered folks from all over the world. He gathered intentionally folks who were supporters and writers for the traditional plan, supporters and writers for the kind of status quo plan, and the supporters and writers for the fully affirming and open plan, as well as representatives from around the world. Okay? So he did this very quickly, And it was a really incredible meeting of hearts and minds and coming together and saying, what do we do? And they had a couple of meetings where they were like, how do we make all of this happen? And eventually they had a meeting where somebody finally said, we can't. So how do we create a plan to amicably separate? So this became known as the recommendation for peaceful separation. Okay? Paragraph 2553 was inserted by the special conference with the intention of progressive affirming, I don't like the term progressive, not helpful, affirming congregations to leave. So it was made for folks who wanted to be affirming to take their stuff and leave. Okay? And then they were bringing this to 2020, and it was basically going to solidify and create a plan to say, okay, churches who want to separate can separate, but the plan for peaceful separation, this is where it changes, okay? The traditional plan made space for paragraph 2553, which was for affirming churches to leave. The plan for peaceful separation was written for traditionalist churches to leave. Do you see how quickly that changes? It became very clear in the aftermath of the special conference this was not the will of United Methodism. United Methodists were polled overwhelmingly, came out in support of LGBTQ marriage inclusion, and we realized this wasn't right, so it switched from affirming churches to leave to traditional churches will have a path to leave. And this was supported overwhelmingly. This time of peaceful separation was recommended overwhelmingly and was sent to the General Conference to be voted upon at our international body in 2020, and then COVID. Okay? So 2020, we don't meet. 2021, we don't meet. 2022, we don't meet. And the traditionalist group that had written that plan kept having meetings. They were still kind of organizing. And then when it was announced in 2022 that we would not be meeting until 2024, they announced, actually before that announcement, so nobody knew that we weren't meeting in 2022 yet, and they went ahead and said they were starting their denomination, which is called the Global Methodist Church. So GMC, when I say GMC, is the Global Methodist Church, which is a denomination of traditionalists who are disaffiliated from the United Methodist Church. Okay? So they launched, they're going to exist, they started making their version of the discipline, I don't know what it's called, and basically announced, we will start receiving churches who disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church. Of course, we all know, right? We read paragraph 2553. It said you have to have a difference of conscience of the discipline. The discipline is not affirming. So it went to the Judicial Council. And the Judicial Council was asked to rule if traditionalist churches could disaffiliate on the basis of paragraph 2553, even if the discipline hasn't changed yet. And it took them a really long time to decide. And then they finally announced, they gave us like no time to turn around. It was like late December 2022, they finally came back and said, yes, churches that want to disaffiliate who are traditionalists, who want to go with the traditional plan, can disaffiliate on the basis of this, under the assumption that in 2024 the discipline will change. That was the argument of the Judicial Council. Okay? But the date was already set under the assumption that General Conference would happen in 2020. Okay? So the 2023 date cannot be changed because it would require a General Conference to change it. The Judicial Council was like, we're sorry, that's the date. So December 2022, they're like, okay, go. So that's how we got where we are. Okay? And so this also means that all the legislation that was coming in 2020 and all the delegates who were elected for 2020 are the same delegates and the same legislation that will go on the table in 2024. Okay? We didn't get to do new stuff. We're doing the old stuff. However, conferences that had delegates who were elected who have been disaffiliated can replace those delegates, whereas those of us who have delegates who maybe just can't go can't replace them. I can't explain that either. It doesn't make sense to me, but it is what the Judicial Council rules. Okay? This means Not a lot right now, but it'll mean a lot as we get closer to the conference. I'll explain how it works. For all of you curious, Greg Seeley, our very own Greg Seeley, is our primary delegate. Okay? From the PNW. Be nice to him. Buy him lots of coffee and tea and lovely vegan treats going into that, because he'll be working very hard. Okay. That's how we got where we are. I'm going to show you this slide now. So this, I want to first of all highlight that this is published by UMC. If you want more information, probably more information than you could ever deal with, about United Methodist Church, you go subscribe at UMC. Okay? And the newsletter goes out every week, gives us information. This data comes from them. This is research. Go back to. Sorry. That's okay. This data comes to us from the Lewis Center, which is from Wesley Seminary, and which is one of our seminaries. Okay. So the green bar is the number of United Methodist churches by jurisdiction. Remember, we have the 5 jurisdictions. Okay. We can see that the largest jurisdiction by population of number of churches is Southeastern. Okay. We can see that the Western jurisdiction is the smallest by number of churches. Okay. That does not mean, but I want to make clear, this is where this graph is a little misleading visually. It does not mean that 1/5 of our churches in the West have disaffiliated. That's not what that means. It means 1% of churches in the Western jurisdiction have disaffiliated. Okay? So we're looking at 2 different data points between green and orange. I just want to clarify that. Or yellow, whatever it is. We can also see that the largest number of churches that are disaffiliating are in the Southeast jurisdiction. Okay? You can see about 1/2 of all churches that are disaffiliated come out of the Southeast. Okay? So this is, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, Florida have a lot of churches disaffiliate. South Central is Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, that area. We can see that's the next biggest. North Central is the next biggest by number of disaffiliations. That's your upper Midwest, UP and Midwest. You can see Northeast and Western were the lowest. Okay? And then the question, of course, is what are the churches that are disaffiliating like? And we have lots of information about them too. We can go to the next slide. Nope, that was backwards, sorry. The bishop of the Western North Carolina Annual Conference has said, in his experience in the Southeast jurisdiction, the more of the churches that are disaffiliating tend to be rural. Okay? And this is true pretty much across the board, not just in the Southeast. It's not a rule, but it's not exclusively only rural churches, but it is more common. So, for instance, we had 13 churches disaffiliate from PNW this spring. St. John is one of them. I think all but one were rural, and the ones on the west side, kind of in southern, western Washington. Anatoly disaffiliated. Those are things, okay? Bishop Carter said that disaffiliation skewed rural because of the cumulative effect of the pandemic and political polarization. Polarization worsened, for example, when debates flared up about whether masks should be worn in church and how the church should respond to racism if it should respond at all. This is a newspaper called the Daily Yonder. They are a rural news organization in the Southeast. They're not a religious one, they're just a news agency, but they're watching this happen. So, what we do know about the churches that are disaffiliating is they're more predominantly white than churches that are staying. They are more likely to be led by a male pastor, and they are almost all, like if you take the numbers, like, right, this is our southeastern section of the United States, right? This is the south and over Texas. So if you get on your news and it says southwest, it means Texas. Where for us in the West, we need California. I can have one more slide, Barry. No, that Okay. So that's just some information about which churches are disaffiliating. You can do with that what you will. I just wanted to provide that for you. I'm going to hand it over to Diane and Rick, and they're going to share some stuff for us.
Thank you. Megan talked a lot about history, and so I want to talk a little bit about history of covenant. I think it's important to know the history of covenant and how they acted with the Pacific Northwest Conference and the UMW, the UMC Church in general. In 1978, 4 couples from Audubon Park Methodist Church in Garland met with the Pacific Northwest Conference delegates, and they had, at the time, they had purchased property in the Indian Trail area to build another church, because they didn't think anybody lived north of Francis Avenue. And so we met, and they decided to sell that property. And one of the couples that were in our group, he was real estate. He knew about this property and wanted this 5 acres. And so the Pacific Northwest Conference approached the owner, and they sold him this property where covenant now stands, 5 acres. And then in 1980, another benefit of going into the conference, they appointed an outstanding young pastor from Walla Walla to be our new pastor, Dave Gillespie. And so Dave moved to Spokane, and in those days, the churches furnished a parsonage or a housing for the pastor. And so the conference loaned us money to buy a house like 2 blocks here from this property. And that's where Dave and his family lived. And it had a big enough basement. That's where we held church for the first few weeks and meetings about how to grow this church. And then there was also a place about a mile from here called the North Spokane Square Dance Hall. And that's where we met, was the Square Dance Hall. And it was quite a challenge because we'd have to go set up chairs, and we had partitions for the Sunday schools. And we met there for about a year, and because of Dave's ambitious and wonderful preaching, we outgrew that area. And then we found St. George's School, and we went there for 3 years. And again, we would still have to go in and set up, the chairs and the classrooms, but it was a beautiful place to meet. And especially our sunrise services there along the river were just wonderful. Another thing is that then when we were ready to build, the Pacific Northwest Conference gave us a low-interest loan that they could build the narthex and the classrooms as the first phase. And so that's, again, where they stepped up to help us out. Then a few years later, we wanted to build a sanctuary. Again, they stepped up and loaned us some money on a low-interest loan to build a sanctuary. And then, as Kent knows, a few years later, we had to resize. Many years later, we had to resize the church, and they loaned us money again to do that project.
And we're paying off.
Besides also helping us with the loans for the churches, one thing Megan mentioned earlier, they do a call system or appoint pastors, and so they've appointed wonderful pastors over these years to Covenant that helps us grow and nurtures us. And so that's one thing they provide. They also provide affordable health care for the pastors, and also, as you mentioned, pension funds for pastors. And so then they also have the district superintendents to support the pastors and the bishop. They also have the UMC Missions Global Health. We participate in through apportionments, and UMCOR has really, as you noticed, stepped up in all these fires and also the flood, Hawaii, and it's a blessing to be part of that United Methodist UMCOR group.
Mm-hmm.
the greatest thing about, being part of the Pacific Northwest Conference is they have been with us every step of the way. You know, they have not abandoned us, they have not told us we can't do something. They've just been there to take care of us. And that is not something that we're gonna have if we disaffiliate, you know. So, now I'll turn it over to Diane.
So I'm going to speak a little bit to not only, well, you've heard the history, but just say a couple things about that, and then I'm going to tell a personal story. We were comfortable with the theology of the United Methodist Church. I'd grown up congregational, and Rick had grown up at Audubon Park, Methodist. And so one thing that I really liked about it is they have female pastors. They also were very interested in women's rights and social justice issues. And I had the opportunity when I was at Audubon and I was young to go to a general conference for United Methodist Women. And at that time, I was introduced to a pastor who was gay, and I heard his story and how he'd been kicked out of the church. And it really broke my heart, and it caused me to start thinking about extremism, separatist, and not being inclusive and loving all of our people. I have a few scriptures. You did a great job on that this morning in the sermon that I just wanted to read that really speak, at least in my opinion, to being an affirming and loving congregation. I'm also taking a theology class at Whitworth, and that has been interesting to study the different theologians over the many years. And just this weekend, we were assigned to read the Black Manifesto by a pastor by the last name of Cohn. I've never heard of him. Mm-hmm. And it has been so enlightening to me personally. It's hard. The process is very difficult with my elderly brain, but it's so rich, and so that has just added to my own personal journey in this area. John 15:13. This is my commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. But now, then Corinthians 13:13. But now abide faith, hope, and love. These three. But the greatest of these is love. And Colossians 3:12-14. Put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, and beyond all these things, put on love, which is the perfect bond in unity. So our personal story goes back to our son when he was in junior high. He became very involved in theater. He also was a great soccer player, so he had the arts and he had the sports. But when he was he's not gay, but when he was in college, as an actor, you are in association with a lot of people that are artistic, that have wonderful abilities in that particular area. His last 2 years of college, he transferred back from the University of Washington, and he was the lead and fiddler on the roof. Had some great opportunities to really be enmeshed in the theater department. And when he eventually got married, his best man was gay, and many of his friends also were gay. So, you know, that would have been in about 1995. So that's when things were just starting to heat up. But again, it really made us look carefully at that issue. And and how that impacted us personally. His wife, who was also an actress, she grew up in a Presbyterian church, but she really felt the call to go into ministry, and she chose the Episcopal Church because at that time the Episcopal Church was more affirming in all areas of the LGBTQ community. So that again was another emphasis that kind of caused us to continue to think about this issue. And then 3 years ago, a grandson of ours, he is bright, he's precocious, he's sensitive, he's creative, he's very artistic, a deep thinker. He was an all-state soccer player, 4.0 student, ASB president, and he came out to us 3 years ago. He was 23 at the time. It was so painful because he said he has known for 10 or 12 years that he was gay. He was so ashamed. They were attending a more conservative church at the time. And again, he felt so much guilt that he felt this way. He did not tell anyone of his feelings. He worked hard to seek approval by being the perfect child. He dated females trying to be straight for 10 years. He even attended a more conservative college where these feelings continued, but he still got a 4.0. And so when he came out to our family, it was painful for us. It hurt us that he had this journey by himself for 10 years. And again, it opened up our eyes to not only our own families, that's what so many families have gone through over these many, many years. We have loved him through it. His family left that church because they said we would never attend a church where we couldn't bring our son and felt that he was affirmed and loved. So this personal experience just reaffirmed for us our commitment to being an open, welcoming, and affirming church. He's now in grad school. He's found a loving community there, and he is very much welcomed and healing. He was just in town for a wedding about 2 weeks ago, and he hadn't seen any of his high school friends. And he said, I was really nervous because they all, of course, now, he came out and everybody knows. And he said, I don't know why I was so nervous. He said, young people are affirming. Young people look at life differently than we old people. And so, that just made us really feel that, he's healing. He can be who he is, and we can love him through that. And we've already talked about young people today and how they don't look at life like we did. And so we are proud of Covenant and the loving church that we are and the direction that we're going. All are welcome.
Okay, so I just have a brief thing to share and let you know that as the six of us work together to prepare this presentation, we had thoughtful discussions about the topic, as you can well imagine. But as the conversation and planning was drawing to a close, I began to feel that something that needed to be said was missing. And it was hard for me to articulate. I had a strong sense of it, but so this is why I've written it out, and I had to figure it out as I thought more about it and wrote it. And this is what it is. In our conversations here at Covenant and in the larger church, we have been speaking about LGBTQ plus persons as a group, as if the group itself were a single entity rather than individuals. And while indeed the controversy has been regarding a group of people, what seems of overriding importance to me is that they are individual people. They are not they are part of us. We are all human beings created and loved by God. I thought about the individuals in our own congregation who could be described by that acronym, LGBTQ+. And I realized that is not how I relate to them. I know them as individuals, friends, fellow followers of Christ, all of us part of the body of Christ on this earth. When I think of covenant and all of us in our variety of differences, I think we.
I also wanted to add, I think maybe the most important thing to me that I could say is that I'm not angry that the church is splitting apart, and I'm not angry at the people who are leaving to go to the world church, global church. This is a legitimate division over different ways to understand our faith. And whether I agree with them or not, I care about it. And I think especially now we need to keep in mind in our prayers those churches who are going to be very split by this. It's going to be very, very painful for them, as these things always are. And they are, I believe, seeking to follow their conscience, follow their faith. And if we do that, if we start to treat them as others, that whole othering thing, we're doing the very thing we're trying to overcome. This isn't about us and them. This is about people that we care about. And that every one of us has the right to arrive at go on our own faith journey. And I do not want this idea of, well, they are messing things up, or they. This is about all people who are children of God. And however this ends up, I hope, the whole, because I read the gospel, Jesus' whole story is, he almost is always, most of the people he heals are other by that cultural definition of the time. Most of the people he eats with, spends time with, are others. They're all people excluded for some superficial reason. And I think the whole message of Jesus' gospel is about this message of love for all. So I just want to say, I actually see this split, and I believe that I read the 2019 document when it came out. I thought it was very well done. It was like having a healthy divorce, if that's possible. There are some times you just can't be together. And rather than acrimonious for throwing insults at one another, it was a very healthy way to divide up the different churches, the different parts of our Methodist connection. And so I would appreciated that. I think it's going to be more able for whichever way churches move to actually get things done, to do Christ's bidding as best as they understand it.
I have a confession. I was not at the meeting when I was put on this committee.
You were in Spain.
I was in Spain or Croatia. I was gone. And so I was a little bit surprised that I was even up here. I have been exposed to some of this through annual conference and a lot of discussions with Marty about the different things that have happened in the past. And I'm aware of Covenant's history and even a little more aware now. And it's gone along quite a while. So for me, I think it's all summed up in that corny bumper sticker that says, "What would Jesus do?" And if anybody in here can find me a teaching of Jesus that says exclude them, don't include them, shut them away someplace, get them out of your company, and don't associate with them, let me know, because I've never read one or heard one from any pastor. So I think covenant's on the right track.
I'm just gonna round this out. The way that we formulated this was in response to a couple of questions. And it became clear that most of the questions are about how does the process function? Like, what does this do? So we divvied up the questions and tried to address them as best as we could. And so I just want to offer up a couple of clarifications that I think are important. There was some deep unclarity early in the process of this kind of, we'll call it the divorce in the United Methodist Church, that every church was going to have to vote in or out. That is not how the process works. You only hold a vote if you keep, so the process is, you go to your pastor, you say, Pastor, we want to talk about disaffiliation. You then prove, like all of us pastors are under a covenantal obligation that regardless of what we think about that, okay? If you come to the pastor with evidence that you have the necessary votes to disaffiliate or close to it, okay? Then your pastor will notify the district superintendent, who then will start the process of lots of meetings, lots of lengthy discussions, lots of straw votes, and a final vote, okay? In order for a church to disaffiliate requires 67%, okay? So if you come to if anybody went to their pastor and said, Pastor, we've got about 5 people, and your church is not 10 people, it's not going to happen. There's no point, right? Because it's deeply painful for every congregation, right? And there have been congregations that had the majority to say we want to disaffiliate, then went through the discussion process, went through understanding what that actually would mean, and did not vote to disaffiliate. Okay, that happened in our district, in our annual conference, in our area. Okay, and that has happened in lots of other places. And in a lot of places where the vote is very, very close, maybe like 50-50, 60-40, very close, what's happening in those churches, this is what I want us to think about, okay? Covenant does not have that kind of vote split, but if we did, I want you to imagine that from one Sunday to the next, half of our congregation is now a different church, and how painful that would be relationally. Though that is what is happening in some of these churches. Okay? There are churches that have absolutely used this disaffiliation process, this paragraph 2553, as a means to get out from underneath what they think is the unjust oppressive force in the church. And they don't disagree on who that's called. They just don't want to pay apportionments anymore. Or they don't want to do appointments. And they just want to be an independent church. Okay? Even in those churches, this process is gutting and harmful and painful. And that's what I think Marty's metaphor of saying this is like a divorce. Even in the instances where divorce is the best and healthiest and most wholesome option on the table, it hurts. And that's where we're at as a denomination. We're both simultaneously saying you're free to do what you believe God has led you to do, and now we're free to do what God has led us to do. That's where we're at. And it still hurts. And that's okay. Right? We can acknowledge that it hurts and still say this is probably the best option for us to go through this kind of large-scale separation. I think Marty challenged us to pray for those congregations is really apt. I learned this past week while I was gathered with the Pacific Northwest Conference with pastors that one annual conference in North Carolina is actually now having to create a process for some of the churches that have voted to leave to reaffiliate. Because they disaffiliated, got out, and said, this is not what we thought this was. So they've been out for less than a year and are now begging to come back. Okay? I share that with us to say, this is the kind of painful thing that we're looking at, right? And then this annual conference is saying, what do we do? How do we say, great, come back? This is not painless for anybody. Even the churches that are like 99% yes, we're leaving. This is still painful to them. They've lost and severed those relationships that we have. So we addressed the questions that we received. If in the coming, I know some of us are not verbal processors, and some of us like to sit with stuff for a while before we formulate questions. The Google Forms will remain open for anyone in the coming weeks who wants to submit more questions. You have to have your email address on the Google Form so that we can give you an answer. Okay? So if you submit questions, we'll come back together, send you an answer in the coming weeks. My guess is that this will probably be our last conversation about this until after General Conference. And then something might happen, and I'll share what we just like to do. But until then, this is just kind of where we're at. We will have, as an annual conference at CNW, we have another special session called for this month to vote on some churches that maybe are disaffiliating. Sorry, I forgot what I said. So a church votes 67% to disaffiliate. They then have to request of the annual conference to approve that disaffiliation. So bear in mind that the annual conference can say no. And we almost did on one church. And that's part of the connection, right?
If we did disaffiliate, would we lose the building?
Unless we could cut it, so this is the other part of it. This is the only question that we'll be taking because I want to be respectful of time. That December 31st date is also the date that your check has to clear the annual conference. So paragraph 2553, part of the stipulation, it is not the normal payout. Okay, so these churches are not paying what they would normally pay us. They're not paying for their buildings, but they are paying us some. Okay. I will share with you what we learned in the special session because a lot of us were like, why are we giving them their building? Because every annual conference can decide how much they ask out of these churches, okay? And when our annual conference, they crunched the numbers, they sat down with our lawyers and said it's not worth it for us to go to court for these properties. These properties aren't worth keeping, most of them. And then by Washington state law, if a building is no longer being used for the purpose of a worshiping faith community, it is no longer tax-free. So in 2018, we had a recession hit, or 2008, when we had a recession hit, our annual conference had a church that had closed in downtown Seattle, and nobody could buy the property. I want you to fathom how much we would owe in property taxes as an annual conference to pay for that kind of a property. So the annual conference had to work out a pastor to come out every single Sunday evening with a group of at least 5 people and lead a worship service so that we would not pay taxes. Do you think I have time for this? So our annual conference members said it's not worth it for us to take them to court. It's not worth it for us to pay the legal fees. It's not worth it for us to fight these folks. So we recommend this is the amount they owe, whatever. So in order for those 13 churches that we just approved in April, they have their amounts that they owe us. That check has to clear the annual conference office by December 31st, or they do not disaffiliate under the provisions of 2553. So, to your question, Don, if Covenant tomorrow decided we have 67%, we're going to vote and we're going to rush it through to make sure we get into the next special session that's in the middle of this month. And let's say hypothetically that happens. How much do you think we would owe the conference? We would have to, this is just me guesstimating, shot in the dark. We'd have to have a cash check with $200,000 because we wouldn't be paying the building. After that's assuming we could get it done by that meeting. If we don't, we missed our chance. December 31st comes and goes. That cash check is closer to $1.5 million. Okay? That's just shot in the dark numbers. So it'd be much worse. And that's if tomorrow we woke up and said, you know what, we want to disaffiliate. We're not even close to that, I'll just be honest. The only folks who come to me and said, hey, pastor, disaffiliation, but let's talk about it. I had a couple of families when I first came to Covenant who asked me if we swing towards this traditional plan, would we have to disaffiliate to remain open and affirming? A couple of families were really worried about that. So we talked about what disaffiliation looks like, talked about what's actually happening on the jurisdictional level, what's actually happening. And okay, great. And then a couple of folks had talked to me about, hey, what if this is the best thing for us? I tried to get as much information as I have. Covenant is Covenant United Methodist Church. That's the information that we have for you today. As I said, if you have any lingering questions or they come up in the next couple of weeks, you can either email them directly to me. You can fill out the Google form. That link will be in the newsletter, and we will make sure that we answer those as well as we can. Because this is a very bureaucracy-laden process, we need time to gather answers. I don't always have them from the hip, okay? That's why we're trying to be really intentional with how we handle this. So, let me pray for us in closing.
Maybe that's one thing, you talked about that the church, the discipline needs to be changed.
Yes.
Is that the consensus of what is actually going to happen? So we don't have to keep saying, well, we're affirming and we're not for
right.
That's the consensus. Do we know?
That's a good question. I'm hesitant to say we know because we thought we knew going into 2019. The consensus ahead of 2019 is that we were going to swing affirming, and it didn't happen, right? So I would hate to say this is what I think is going to happen and watch us, What I can tell you is that if we say we have 6,000 churches disaffiliated, and those are churches that are like the hardest line traditionalists we don't want to be affirming, and that means that none of those churches who and what I want to say is individual churches we don't send a delegate to the general conference, okay? Greg is not Covenant representative. He is the delegate from the Pacific Northwest annual conference. We elect those folks at the annual conference level, okay? And we elected Greg, God bless him, in 2018, and he's still serving it. I mean, he's tired. So those annual conferences that we're sending folks who are really going to be hardline, no, we are not going to change this, no, we're going to remain traditional. None of them are going to be voting at the next general conference because they're gone. They left, they disaffiliated. And those folks had to be replaced with other delegates. What I can tell you is at jurisdictional conference last year, we all have our jurisdictional conferences at the same time. Okay, so all new bishops are elected at the same couple of days across the various jurisdictions. We had the most diverse and youngest bishop class we've ever elected in our denomination's history. So that's telling me that the young people that are in the church are getting really involved, and that, we did a poll, I think Gallup did it in 2019 after the special conference, and I think the data said about 67 to 70% of all United Methodists at that time were pro-inclusion. So that, then when you are like, well, how do we do that? So I would hate to promise you something and have it fall back. The general consensus is that at least that phrase will be removed if we have time. The legislation that Marty referenced, and he really liked it, it's called the Plan for Peaceful Separation. The recommendation of the Plan for Peaceful Separation. If you want to read it, you can Google that. If you can't find it, come to my office. I'll print out the copy. That's still on the table, and that would open up that disaffiliation process after December 31st for churches that are still like, no, we don't want to be a part of that. But I would say, the numbers seem to be pointing a certain direction towards us not having to constantly say, here we are. And I think Marty and Jake and others said it really well, right? Like, if we're constantly fighting over this, and I would say shadow boxing, like, who are we arguing with at this point? We can't actually do the work that we're called to do, which is getting to the work of being inclusive and being loving and practicing justice and doing compassion, because we're fighting against ourselves. So I'm looking forward to us having matters settled as well. I hope it's a general conference, but we'll see. But let me pray for us. If you have more questions for us, you can grab us on the way out, okay? Lord Jesus, we are grateful that you accepted us, because you know more than anyone the many reasons you have to not accept us. The many reasons that we have disqualified ourselves from love and grace. And yet it is precisely because we do not deserve it, and yet you freely give it to us anyway, that we together as your people say yes and amen every time the circle is drawn wider. Every time there's new us and no longer them, we say yes and amen because your grace is at work in our lives. And so we ask that your grace would continue to be at work in us, that you would continue to draw us on to this Christian perfection of loving you, loving others, loving creation, and loving ourselves. And we do pray for these churches that have disaffiliated. We pray for the ones that still do not have pastors. We pray for the ones who still do not know what's happening in their new denominational body. And Lord, we especially pray for those of us that stay United Methodist. Bind us one to the other, draw our connection closer, make us a covenantal body that represents you in the world and fulfills the mission that you gave us as United Methodists, that we are meant to be people among the poor, that we are meant to be people among the rejected, that we are meant to be people among the least of these, because that is who we have always been called to be, and God willing, it is who we want to be still. We pray these things in your name. Amen.